Okay, good day to you all. So just a few words on behalf of FMG, the Friends of Multilateralism Group. My name is Xiankun Lu, people call me Lu. So basically, this high level on the future of WTO reform was the idea from our former co-chair of FMG board, Alejandro, and the basic purpose was to have some inputs from top experts and leaders around the world on the WTO reform, its future challenges, the way forward, and so on and so forth, so as to enrich a discussion in Geneva. And also, we are going to have some headwinds before us in the way all the way up to MC14 coming and probably beyond that. So that's why we decide to launch the dialogue now. And of course, we want to, that's why we honor Alejandro, and we are honored to have him as the moderator for this first session. And we are even more honored to have Pascal as the first speaker of this high-level dialogue. So I won't waste any time. I will immediately give the floor to Alejandro and to Pascal. And of course, for audience, if you have comments or questions, you can put it there. I will try to bring that attention to the attention of Alejandro and Pascal. So over to you, Alejandro. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you very much. Hello to everyone and Happy New Year. A very warm welcome to Pascal. Just 1 minute of one or two thoughts here. We live in uncertain times. Some of us had a meeting with some missions in Geneva, very few and very confidential. And an outline that was produced for the meeting, I like the title very much. It said, "Thinking the Unthinkable." I'll let you wonder why the unthinkable is. Or as someone characterized rather recently, that we have two big trading powers in the world. One is checking in and the other one is checking out. I will also let you guess which one is which. The future U.S. administration certainly is not helpful in terms of giving us more certainty. This is not new. I would submit to you that there's been a gradual, constant decline of U.S. commitment and leadership towards the multilateral trading system since probably the last months of the Bush administration. And now we have a new administration. Someone characterized President Trump in terms that he's characterized not by values or principles, but by two commanding words. One, create uncertainty, and the other one is make a deal. So in this context, any idea of reform becomes more challenging and more difficult. And that's why we have this idea of launching this dialogue to help us think through what are the options, the scenarios for reform. And no one better to start this, to kick off this, with Pascal Lamy, my former boss, to whom I now give the floor. And we can benefit from his past experience and present wisdom. Pascal.
Thanks very much, Lou. Thanks, Alejandro. Extremely honored to be the first to be grilled on this episode of your club. Extremely impressed at seeing how many of my old friends I see on this Zoom list. It's a sort of a heart shock, emotional heart shock to see so many of you being there, obviously, as friends, and hoping, because we still are in the wishes season, that those among you who are not already my old friends might become friends for the future. So let me try and introduce this discussion by a few remarks. I'm afraid I'm not going to surprise you. I will not come with bombs or rockets that will explode the existing international trading system and replace it with something different in the order of the unthinkable. I'm not the man to do that, but for those of you who want a bit of buzz and thrilling, we have a candidate for that, the name of whom has just been mentioned by Alejandro, which is Donald Trump. But I will not start with Donald Trump, which, in my view, hopefully, is a relatively short-term problem. 5 years or 4 years being a relatively small chunk of time in the long history of international trade and in the reasonably long history of WTO. So I will start with what I see as the sort of longer term issues, and then look at more short-term issues, which may be, as Alejandro said, of the order of the unthinkable. On the long-term problems of WTO and why we need to reform it, while underlining that this word of reform is not very clear, which I think may be an issue we need to think a bit about, because I belong to this category of people who believe that you have to name things right in order to address them right. But leaving this aside, I think the challenges the WTO faces and the reason why it needs some reform are of two natures, and again, nothing new and surprising, I believe, for you. The first one is its relevance, and the second one is its governance. Its relevance is at stake because the WTO is modestly good at addressing old obstacles to trade and not good at all so far at seriously addressing new obstacles to trade, starting, of course, from this very simple premise that the mission statement of the World Trade Organization is facilitate trade, make international exchange easier, thus reduce as much as possible obstacles to trade. Many of you are, if not as old as I am, at least in the same generation. I'm not going to give you the list of what I deem traditional obstacles to trade, tariffs, quantitative restrictions, subsidies, and the like. The reality being that, for a number of reasons, starting with the discrepancies in the level of disciplines of WTO has not finished the job on traditional obstacle to trade. There are a number of leftover in areas like subsidies. Disciplines on subsidies in the WTO are weak, weaker than in other areas where we need to harness trade distortions through trade measures. It's the same for agriculture. These issues did not always get the attention they needed to get. I myself, when I was EU Trade Commissioner, agreed with my colleagues in Japan and the US that the time for narrowing the stitches of the net of disciplines on subsidies was not right, and I regret this. We got it wrong when, before China entered the WTO, we did not address properly this question, and we had it on the do-to list of the Doha round, but that was in a way too late. So these are two examples where the WTO did not finish its own job. And then I think we will all agree that it's not good at addressing its new job, which is addressing new obstacles to trade that evolve as technology evolved, as levels of development evolved, as the level of precaution in a number of areas that our societies, which are for many of them aging and less risk adverse, are now asking for. Digital, environment are well-known examples. And I will nevertheless finish this very short sketch of where we are in saying that nevertheless, the WTO remain good at administering the existing disciplines. They are lagging behind, they are too weak in some areas, but where they exist, but for the hit that the dispute settlement took with the US attitude, and I'll come back to that, the administration of the surveillance, even if the notifications are far from perfect, the WTO remains, compared to other international institutions, good at making sure that the disciplines that its members have subscribed are reasonably well followed. Not fully. And by the way, as you know, I've been among those who tried to push the European Union to replace the paralyzed appellate body with a fix, with a patch, which I think, by the way, is not known enough, although it's working reasonably well. So we have these relevance issues which need to be addressed, and in this sense, the word reform means reforming the rules that WTO members subscribe and that then are enforced. We also have a problem of governance, and again, you know my views on that. I took it from my experience of WTO DG, speaking to colleagues in the other international institutions, observing, studying, looking at how the others work. In this sense, I maintain that in terms of governance, the WTO is a medieval organization. Most of our comparators, most of the other international organizations which are as member-driven as the WTO, which deploy their mission in various areas, are better at governing, leading their organizations, and this is one of the big differences I had with Roberto Azevedo when, and a few of you know that, when we had a sort of substantial discussion when he took over. I think WTO deserves to become an institution. He believes that the WTO should remain an organization. And the difference between an organization and institution is in the quantum of member-driven versus member-driving. I think the Secretariat should have a higher authority in driving the conversation and the negotiations between WTO members. They, of course, have to decide according to procedures which may be streamlined or cleaned up, but the incapacity, the legally forbidden capacity for the Secretariat to table diagnoses and proposals is a big problem. I worked with the Secretariat for many years. I know what they can do and cannot do. What they can do is take a good picture of where there are obstacles to trade that needs to be addressed, and they are competent enough to provide for options or solutions for the members to decide, other than this system where you need a mandate, and once you have a mandate, you need a negotiating group, and once you need a negotiating group, you need to have a chair, which is one of the members, and so on. So that's for the long term. I have to be short. Let me finish with a few words on the short term, which is, in a way, partly short and partly long. We've all been waiting for Trump as if it was coming from another planet with a tariff man just below his MAGA red cap. What we do not know is what does Trump intend to do with his tariffs. There are three things he may intend to do. The first one is reduce the US trade deficit. Bogus. The US trade deficit is there for macroeconomic reasons that have nothing to do with US tariffs. If he puts US tariff with a hope to reduce US trade deficit, this will only increase inflation in the US. And by the way, his first mandate is a good evidence of that, including in the way he erected obstacle to trade with China specifically. Second thing he may want to do is reciprocity on a sectoral basis. For instance, starting from the reality, which he heavily complained when he met Madame Merkel during his first mandate, that there are plenty of Mercedes in New York and zero Chevron in Berlin. This needs to be addressed. This is the evidence that the world trading system is playing against the US automotive industry, the capacity, the competitivity, the quality of which is well known. The reason why Germans don't buy Chevrons is just a result of unfair trade. And there's a lot of that, which he can deploy with other countries. And then there's the third capacity, which is where, by the way, his view that the US trade deficit is a weakness is totally contradicted by the fact that he intends to use it as a strength in arm twisting this or this country, like Canada, like Mexico, for instance, about things that have nothing to do with trade. But if you don't do what I want you to do, I will shoot you with tariffs, the sort of mafia-like revolver, if you don't pay, mentality, which we know is part of the way he behaves. How much of that, for 1, 2, or 3, we don't know. What we all know, I think, is that whatever big increase in US tariffs, whether it's selective and whether it's all over the place, will result in more inflation. And it is, by the way, one of the reasons why US long-term interest rates have increased quite significantly for the last 2 months, which is bad news for the world economy, starting with the US, but in my view, much more worrying is the impact it will have on a number of highly dollar indebted developing countries, including emerging ones who need access to international trade to grow their economy. Leaving this kind of speculation aside, let me first recall, and I will not insist on that, what Alejandro already said, which is that the history of the US distancing themselves from the WTO is now an old one. It started in 2008 in circumstances which we all know. And since then, step by step, they have distanced themselves to the point that whatever use of tariff Trump does probably means that the US are leaving the WTO de facto. So the unthinkable of, let's say, 20 years ago, which is what would the WTO be without the US, is now thinkable. And this is why when I'm asked, what should we do with Trump, I usually give this public answer, which I share with you. WTO members should together say, if we are hit by WTO non-compliant trade measures by the US, we will retaliate according to our rights and within the disciplines the WTO provides to exercise our rights. That's the number one of what WTO members together should say. And the second thing they should say is that while doing this, they intend to stick to their existing WTO commitment, that they will avoid any domino effect on the rest of the trading system, because we still believe that open trade is better than closed trade, and that protectionism is not the way to go for a large party of this planet who again still needs international trade to grow their economy. For the rest, I think we have to imagine and think a WTO where the US would be inactive, assuming they don't push, but assuming they don't prevent. And the question there, and I leave this for the rest of your discussions, I think we can live with the US who do not push. After all, it's 15% of world imports. We still can work with 85% of the remaining part of world imports. But then if the US use this position to prevent, in the name that decisions have to be taken to consensus, we need to overcome this obstacle. And then I think we should commission a group of fine, experienced and clever lawyers, and this is perfectly doable, to find the necessary solutions. Over to you. I hope I have not been maybe a few minutes longer than my 20 minutes, but it's marginal. Over to you, my friends.
Thank you very much, Pascal. That's a fine way to begin a conversation about WTO reform in a scenario of great uncertainty. And as you said, in a scenario in which the United States is de facto leaving the organization. And so maybe we'll have to change the name of this group, Friends of Multilateralism Group. Okay, so I now open questions and comments, and Carlos Primo Daga, you go first.
Thanks, Alejandro. I guess Pascal basically already answered one of the questions that you pose about thinking the unthinkable. And of course, if we go in this direction, what comes to my mind is a saying from Antonio Gramsci: the old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time for monsters. So if we go in this direction, my question to Pascal and to you, Alejandro, and to all colleagues is how to avoid the domino effect. If I fully agree that there needs to be a show of strength from those that believe in the institution and the role of international trade in economic development. But how, if retaliation focusing on the actions of the US is adopted, how can we avoid the domino effect in a world that is characterized by global value chains and by a very interlinked trade environment? Thanks.
Thank you, Carlos. A lot of political energy will be necessary. Lou, your turn.
Yeah, thank you. Many thanks to Pascal. I just have a question regarding developing countries for both long-term and short-term challenges. Because for me personally, I always believe that for whatever long-term or short-term, that the majority of WTO members who are developing countries, especially vulnerable small ones, LDCs, should not be left behind. But looking what we have done in the past 20, 30 years, we do see a kind of, how to say, a kind of different engagement through by these countries for many reasons. First, their lack of capacity, they need help, or for the new trade issues, they say that we don't even have those industries or such a we don't see how we can benefit from them, or we don't understand what rules might be like and how they impact. So there are many things around developed countries which would handicap their participation, meaningful and effective participation. So which will be problematic. So be it multilateral, plurilateral, or whatever the format, including governance, other things. So my basic question to Pascal and others is that how do we establish anything kind of to keep on engaging those members so as they could be participating, or as we are seeing, there won't be, I would say, be participating from the negative side, as we have seen some discussions on decision making and others. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ignacio Garcia will be followed by John Clark.
Hello, Pascal. Good to see you. I mean, I tend to agree with what you have said. I only really have two comments. The first one goes in the direction of what Lou has just said. Is the problem only the United States? Isn't there at least another big member of the WTO that is likely to be an obstacle to moving forward with the WTO agenda, and how to deal with that? Plus the issue of those members of the WTO that don't feel they have much of a stake in terms of how the system is working. And my second comment is the real obstacle to move forward a legal one that can be solved by a clever lawyer, or is it much more of a political one? To what extent are WTO members going to be ready to move forward, even knowing that there's a high likelihood that the United States would not be able to join what happens in terms of the outcome of an agreement? I mean, I think that if you look into the challenge for the WTO, dispute settlement is already one option to move forward, which is the NPIA. Investment facilitation, e-commerce, the main obstacle is not the United States, but again, there are options to move forward. Even if you look into issues like subsidies, would WTO members be ready to start discussing how to modernize the rules on subsidies in the WTO, both agriculture and industry, even knowing that at the end of the day, maybe the United States would not be ready to be part of such an agreement. So I think for me, it's not so much a legal question, it's much more a question of political will of the other members of the WTO to move forward.
Thank you. John Clark.
You're muted.
You're muted. John, you're muted.
There we go. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Pascal, thanks for your, as always, brilliant expose. I'm very heartened by your long-term conclusion that we have to survive if you like, Trump for 4 or 5 years, and we should look at the long term. That's very heartening. 2 or 3 comments. You suggested that the US will not push but may not prevent. I think they will prevent. anything going forward in the WTO, whether it's DSU reform, whether it's fisheries, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's the JSIs, anything else. So I think we have to be realistic about that. They will not only not push, they will also prevent, because they don't believe in the system, and really haven't done well before 2008, by the way, ever since not since 1995. On your call for the Secretariat to be given a bit more leeway, which I think we all agree with, that will not happen. I think if there's a conscious debate about it. I think the WTO DG needs to do what the WIPO DG did a few years ago, which is basically just move ahead regardless, and get the Secretariat to do things, do research, make proposals, and brave the storm. That worked very well in WIPO, which moved as a result from being a very technical organization to one much more powerful and political. Alejandro, in your introduction, you mentioned the two kind of powers in the WTO that are calling the shots. I think it's a bit premature to dismiss the EU as one of the triumvirate in the WTO. I mean, the EU is the biggest economy in the world still, and so I think it's not helpful to suggest that the WTO's and the multilateral trading system's future will be dictated by US and China. It's at least a threesome, probably a foursome or fivesome with India and ASEAN. But that brings me to a question for Pascal and for all of you, which is, what if anything can the EU as a member do to resurrect or remedy the situation that we find ourselves in? And are we to blame in some ways for having gone headlong into FTAs, which have undermined the WTO, and in being so conservative, shall I say, on agriculture, which has to be one of the things which will unlock progress in the WTO in the future?
Thank you. Pascal, would you like to react?
Yes, let me react briefly while praising your suggestion, Alejandro, that your group should be called Friends of Multilateralism. To Carlos, who rightly quotes Gramsci and his monsters, and who questions how can the rest of the WTO membership avoid the domino effect. This comes to the question which others have raised, which is assuming what should be done is what I sketched, which is one, we will use our WTO rights if US hit us with WTO non-compliant measures. Second, we together reaffirm our willingness not to indulge in protectionism and to avoid the possible contamination effect of retaliatory measures. I agree that this is a question of political will. And jumping to what John Clark just said, I personally believe, but I may be biased, that the one to take the lead of such a coalition should be the EU. And then the test would be, assuming a number of usual suspects would follow, two tests would be, where is China? Does China join the band? And where is Africa? Where does Africa join the band? I recognize this is a diplomatic conundrum. I will not go public on the conversations I may have from time to time with Ngozi, but this is something that I hope has been already envisaged here and there. So how to avoid the domino effect is a decision of a political nature which WTO members should together take. Now, I know the risk of this. The risk of putting something like this on the table is that it makes a flop, in which case it probably would be worse than saying nothing, because if it appears that there is only a small group of trade wonks that is ready to join such operation, that would be dangerous. So it's a question of a political judgment. On the question by Lu on poorer developing countries, my view is that the real problem for developing countries is not in classical trade obstacles, the ones of the previous generations, the tariff, the subsidies, the quantitative restrictions. The main issue, because there the WTO and the GATT had a sort of a variable geometry framework that would more or less succeed in proportioning trade opening and trade restriction obligations to the level of development. The real issue is in non-tariff measures, where, as we all know by definition, there is no variable geometry for non-tariff measures, and this is where the problem of capacity by developing countries to match the growing precautionary quality, safety, green credentials is the big problem. And the solution to that is, in my view, what we tried to do, and reasonably successfully, I think, although we did everything right during the times we were in Geneva, the notion that we held with the Aid for Trade system, which was a very pragmatic way of redirecting as much as possible of development assistance to trade capacity building. We need to renovate this endeavor with non-tariff measures, starting, of course, with the environment, which, at least seen from where I am now, which is within the EU, although I still spend a lot of time on other continents, is the real issue. And those of you who follow what the Europe Jacques Delors think tank in Brussels, who is working notably on the greening and notably on greening trade, we've been, I think, relatively successful in pushing the EU Commission and the European Union in re-looking at their greening trade policy and strategy, not just in adjusting trade and environment, but in re-looking at the triangle between trade, development, and environment, hence redirecting as much as possible of what we can transfer to enhance the capacity of developing countries to be able to match the standards. It's not a whole problem for everybody. They have their comparative advantage in some trade, whether it's goods or services, and for many of them, a lot in goods. So it may be something that is done rather focused or laser-like, but in my view, the solution is on the side of capacity building, which would never be separated from the possibility to trade. As we said at the time, one thing is to allow trade to flow, the other thing is to make trade flow, and this is where there is an issue which I think needs to be enhanced. The question by Ignacio, right, I agree with you. It's mostly a question of political will and of somehow risk-taking. On the issue of subsidies, the big question is whether members of WTO would be ready to do now what they were not ready to do at the end of the 90s, which is strengthen subsidy disciplines. I'm not sure about that. The big problem is not just China now, it's many other countries, starting with the US, given that the rebalancing of security concerns on international trade and the sort of different balance we have between geoeconomics and geopolitics does not bode well for, I think, new disciplines on subsidization. I would not put agriculture on the front line for the moment. Not that I don't care about agriculture. I now chair the board of IFPRI, which is, as you know, the sort of OECD for agriculture, although Marion Johnson does a good job in her OECD division. But when I look at the numbers of where are major agricultural subsidies today, it's China and India who come top of the list. Whether this is or not trade distorting is another issue. On the question by John, I already, I think, addressed the question of whether some would be ready to move ahead. Again, I think if the EU would be ready to take the lead of such a coalition, that would be, I think, the easiest way to go. I'm not saying it will happen, not least because you have this entanglement on the EU side between what happens on the Ukrainian front and what happens on the American tariff front. The EU is caught in between two fires, Putin on the one side, and somehow China helping Putin, if not that openly, at least in reality. And on the other side, Trump tariffs. And I can see within the EU Commission, or even in the EU Parliament, which is, as you know, more right-wing than in the past, or even in a number of member states, I can see a conversation of should we be on nice with the US while we need them to keep helping us in Ukraine. This is not a theory, this is a political reality. Some people in Brussels will say, let's keep the transatlantic relationship as strong as possible. Otherwise, Putin and the US will leave us alone on the Ukrainian front, which would be, if not a disaster, at least a weakening of the Ukrainian position. So we enter this into non-trade areas, but given the state of the world, and given that geopolitics now are having the sort of upper hand on the good geoeconomics of our time, not that, again, everything was perfect, but the world was certainly a different place. I think this has to be considered. Just one remark on the comment of John, where I don't agree with what he hinted at. Many of you know that. I've never thought FTAs were a problem for the WTO. I stick, as I did in the past, with the Chinese proverb, don't mind the color of the cat, provided it catches mice. If FTAs catch obstacle to trade, they don't do it in a way that in reality is as trade distortive as the way some theoreticians like our good friend Bhagwati have written, not least because all practitioners know that only one part of what FTAs brings in terms of benefits, including on tariffs with the necessary bureaucracy on rules of origins, is a temperament of the possible trade distorting impact of bilateral or regional FTA. But this is a long-standing problem, and I don't want to insist on that. Over to you.
Thank you, Pascal. I now have Mario Matus, followed by Wenhua, Yi, and Lu.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pascal, for your interesting points, illuminating as usual. You mentioned, very short question, you mentioned that in the short term, you're suggesting that members of WTO should retaliate together, you meant. You didn't mention collectively. Well, okay, but together. And probably that will happen. That's it's very likely that that will be one of the outcome of the presidency in the short term. I mean. The point is that we all know that part of the main problems of WTO in the past has been precisely the idea of reciprocity. So this is connected with Carlos' question on contamination or domino effect. But at the same time, on the one hand, we're going to retaliate, or the countries that are able to do so, and this will create a sort of process of crossing retaliations, and the world after the short term will be very, very complicated. So I don't imagine a world where we're going to go back after the short term to eliminate this system of cross retaliation. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Wenhua?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jara. I would like to thank Pascal for this very enlightening and thought-provoking presentation. I just want to follow up some follow-up comments concerning, because Pascal asked where is China. Of course, and I'm in Beijing, but I won't speak on behalf of the government. But I think the Chinese government, the official position is very clear. China strongly and firmly supports a multilateral trading system. And indeed, and this afternoon, a group of scholars, Chinese scholars, we had a very interesting internal discussion concerning how China could work with EU to support the multilateral trading system, and in the name of support WTO reform. And one idea is that we could jointly, EU and China EU, could jointly table a proposal or a document or statement, something like that, to show their support. And do you think this idea is possible, or do you think it's a mission possible? Because whether EU would like to work with China to produce such a kind of document. The reason is that I saw Professor Yang Guohua from Tsinghua University also ask this question, because indeed this proposal was tabled originally from Professor Yang. He said that because Pascal, you said we should build within the WTO a united front against American protectionism. So do you think such kind of joint proposal by EU and China, maybe perhaps with other leading members, is a possible mission? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now have pleasure giving the floor to my favorite national of Oman, Hilda.
Hello, Pascal. Very nice to see you. Thank you very much, Alejandro. My question is related to giving the Secretariat more power and authority. I'm just wondering if this will turn WTO into another UNCTAD, because UNCTAD secretariats, they prepare a lot of documents and papers and reports, which are very useful and very good, but they end up in debates among members and then no outcome or positive results. And the second point is, do you think with the shift of power and WTO's position at the moment, there will be more role to be played by G20 or BRICS? Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. I now, before giving the floor back to Pascal, I will read a question by Didier Chambouvet. He said, as we have seen under the first trade mandate, the response by the trade mandate, I suppose that Trump, the response by WTO member was more or less sauve qui peut. In other words, a number of members have sought bilateral arrangements to protect their own trade interests in the narrowest meaning of the term, among others, measures that were inconsistent with WTO agreements such as export restriction agreements. Are we going to see more of the same this time again instead of an orderly and compliant WTO? That's the Didier. And I think he was already quoted, Gohan Yang asking, he says that Pascal was quoted as saying we should build within the WTO united front against American protectionism. If you can elaborate on this and specify the areas and ways of that front. Thank you. Pascal?
Okay, so to Mario, I recommend some sort of show of strength. Because this is the way to behave with the US. I've never properly negotiated with the US without a gun not too far from my pocket. Not to use it, but they know it's there. Second, it probably would necessitate some sort of cross-retaliation. And the big question there is, for instance, would some WTO members cross-retaliate in waiving some bits of the intellectual property agreement? The US don't have just a few weaknesses if they are hit on orange juice or Harley-Davidson, which, by the way, are more a problem with Japan, given what they are composed of. But if cross-retaliation was to hit IP and the TRIPS agreement, then the song might be different. So I think this needs to be factored in the examination of possible reactions. The domino effect, I think we should address it collectively, saying that we know there's a risk. If you look at the numbers, assuming the US is 15% of world imports, assuming that, let's say, 1/3 of that, which is a huge lot, would be impacted, this is 5% of world trade. And 5% of world trade does not trigger a domino effect. So I think we're all remembering the 1930s and the Smooth-Hardley tariff. And you remember I had a picture of these two guys proudly shaking hands in my office of DG of WTO. And the question was, who are they? I've never seen these guys. I said, well, they are the real founders of the GATT and the WTO. So they deserve their picture to be in my office. As, by the way, the one of Ricardo, the one of Schumpeter, and the one of Karl Marx, who are the three saints that we need around the founders of the GATT in Mr. Smooth and Mr. Hadley. To G. Wenha, and he's right, I haven't mentioned China a lot, and it's a bit of the elephant in the room. I do not think EU and China should start, the two of them simultaneously, this coalition building. I think this would be seen as anti-US, and it would not be an anti-US, it would be an anti-Trump coalition, trade-wise, I mean. So I think it would be better for the EU to take the lead, to be joined by the Singapore, Chile, Norway, Switzerland, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the sort of middle rounders, and then China hesitating, and taking its time, and then at the end joining. I think if I had to put the thing together, I would not start with an EU-China coalition, although I'm also in favor of a larger trade conversation between EU and China. I've been working for the last 6 months on a big study between the Institut Jacques Delors in Paris, this one, and Sciences Po, and with our colleague Alejandro Jara, on a big report for the Association of European Car Manufacturers on the future of electric mobility in Europe, which is a big problem. And I can see, to take this example, an area where a strategic conversation between EU and China, notably on electric value chains resulting from Chinese investment in the EU would take place. So that's my answer to this question, while recognizing that, to be frank, China has not been an active member of the WTO. Since it joined, for many years, China got behind the screen of a newly acceded member. This does not float anymore, thanks to the passage of time. What China has been doing in opening parts of its economy has been done for the benefit of Chinese producers, where it's obvious that opening a bit more makes sense for China to grow its economy in upping the added value ladder. But the notion for China that they would reciprocate and agree on terms of a multilateral deal where others would ask China to do something, China would ask others to do something, and this would result in an agreement, has not been the way forward. And this is where China's attitude in the WTO is not in line in what the spirit of WTO is. I recognize that there may be a reason for that in the notion in China that at the time they paid their accession much more expensively than many other developing countries at the time. This, nevertheless, is something which I think should be addressed. To Hina, WTO and UNCTAD are not comparable. UNCTAD is a talk shop. WTO has teeth. And by the way, to be very frank, and I hope if this conversation goes public, I won't ruffle too many feathers. I still wonder why, from the moment that all developing members are members of WTO, why do we still have an UNCTAD? To be frank, this is very strange. Now, the answer is, but there is nothing like a Cartesian logic in the way international organizations are born, given that they never die. Okay, but I mean, I think this is a bias in the system. If there was somebody running the system rationally, we would save a bit of money and time in having the WTO absorbing UNCTAD, including, by the way, the capacity it has built in areas where WTO members have forbidden the WTO to build capacity, such as, for instance, competition. Could the BRICS or the G20? No. The G20 is stuck. If you look at the G20 declarations, there's an interesting exercise to be done, which is to see how many paragraphs now start by "we reaffirm." It's probably that in 1 or 2 years, all paragraphs of the G20 will start with "we reaffirm," which means that the G20 is useless. Unfortunately, and I'm one of the believers that at the time when it was created, it would bring fresh blood and energy in the system. No. And as far as BRICS are concerned, I know of a few things where the BRICS agree. I know of a few things where the BRICS disagree, and trade is one of the few things where BRICS disagree. So I wouldn't bet on the BRICS club push to move things forward. To Didier Chambovet, I think he's right on the export restriction side. This is an old issue which has been there for a long time, and the fact that we haven't properly disciplined export restrictions, although we've had some examples of the implementation of these subsidies with China rare earth, for instance, we did a very limited progress on the food restriction side for the part that has to do with the World Food Programme. But I agree that export restrictions in the world of critical materials is much more of an issue than in the past, and that it deserves more attention. And finally, on this coalition, again, if there was to be a coalition, it should not be seen or interpreted too easily on the US side as an anti-US coalition, which probably would prevent some of the members to join because they will not want to be seen as anti-US. It has to be anti-protectionism and not anti-US. I recognize it's a diplomatic conundrum. It needs clever people to do that. But I think one of the conditions for such a coalition to emerge is that the necessary precautions are taken, that it is not a global anti-American, and it's not US, Russia, China, who are wanting to push back on the US and to reform in whatever way the international system at large that is behind this coalition, which is why EU, in my view, should take the lead.
Thank you, Pascal. It's past the hour. This was supposed to last until 1 hour, right? So we are a little over our time. We thank you very, very much for sharing your thoughts, for your time. I think that you have shown a path ahead, and I think this is a very powerful idea, which we have to all reflect upon and act upon when the time comes. Maybe the time is now, by the way. We can't wait that much. So, while inviting our members to give you a round of applause, I again bring this meeting to a close. I don't know if Lou wants to say something.
No, just one quick word. Thanks, of course, to Pascal and you for the great session. No, just a quick note to audience and also our members that after this dialogue, hopefully every month or every several weeks, we are going to invite more top leaders and experts to share their views on the future of the WTO and its reform. So stay tuned, and thanks to you all, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.